really, really deeply inwardly funny. And he knows how funny he is. And somehow that's contagious too. When he would shuffle across the stage and say, Mrs. Wiggins, my wife and I would crack up. And every once in a while we call each other Mrs. Wiggins. It's contagious. The accent and the walk and the attitude. Sometimes I think Carol would break up just watching him walk across the stage. Carol told me a wonderful story while we were shooting Four Seasons. We were down in a tropical place, and there was a big palm tree that went up through the roof of the room we were in at an angle. And she told about being at a resort like that with Tim Conway. And at the end of the evening, he said, well, I'm going to bed. Good night. And he walked over to the tree and walked up the tree to the ceiling. I don't know how far he got, but she couldn't stop laughing when she told me that, because that's the kind of thing he would do. He would take a real life situation and make it absurd and play it fully like he really meant it. He's a real extraordinary talent. I wonder if the audience knew that they weren't supposed to like a show headed by a woman, because they sure ate it up when Carol's show went on the air and stayed on the air all those years. I think there's a kind of foot dragging that occurs because things are the way they are. People are afraid to change them slightly in an obviously reasonable direction, like having a woman head a variety show. But the people who thought they knew what they were talking about, who ran the networks, were convinced that because it hadn't been done before, it couldn't be done, which is kind of odd, because anything that's interesting and original hasn't been done before. So if you keep giving them the same thing they've always seen, how are you going to make anything new? I think that Carol was probably an ideal person to break that barrier, because she's so appealing and has, when you see her out there doing the Q&A, she has a gentle but real authority. She has every right to be there, and you know it when you watch her answering those questions. She enjoys the audience, but she can kid them. She can take them through stories that have a real sense of confidence about them. So there's no reason that she shouldn't have headed that show. That they hesitated for a moment is kind of amazing, but it's hard to believe that those were the days that we were in at that time. Now it's hard for us to believe now that in Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to drive cars. Well, when Carol was being told you can't head a variety show because you're a woman, there were states, or at least one state I know of, where a woman couldn't own property unless a man's name was on the deed, possibly along with hers, but there had to be a man there. So it's not very long ago that these bizarre things that we now regard as bizarre and will regard as even more bizarre as time goes on, were the norm. So I'm glad Carol was able to break that mold. All I knew was that it was an extraordinary program, because there was terrific music, dancing, and unbelievably good sketch comedy. I don't think I was aware of it as a social phenomenon, but I always knew that I could be elevated by the skill, the talent of the people, the inventiveness, the originality of the people on the show. It was always dependable. And the whole country felt that way, no matter where you were in the social strata. Everybody could enjoy her. She really cut across all the lines. It was a real contribution she made. Everybody would want to be on that show, I would think, because you got good material to do and you got to work with Carol. And Carol is special among all the people who have done what she does. She's special. you can't help but influence people if you're that talented. If you, I mean, anybody with talent, watching somebody with that much talent, gets inspired by it. It's really inspirational to watch somebody at the peak of their powers do it so effortlessly. When I was a young actor, I would, before I'd leave the apartment to go be in a play on Broadway, I'd be watching Lucy Ball, and I'd be inspired by her. She wrote me a note once, and had seen me in a movie or something, and wrote me a nice note. And I wrote her back and told her how I was inspired by her, and I watched her before we went on the stage. And as I wrote it, I thought, I wonder if she's going to think this is weird. But we all do that, and it doesn't matter what the sex of the performer is. You can be inspired in your own personal work by somebody of the opposite sex. It doesn't matter, or even another species. Have you ever seen Benji? It's really good. I can't, I never tried it. Oh! I'm so glad we had this time together, just to have a laugh or sing a song. Seems we just got started, and before you know it, comes the time we have to say so long.
I had a mad crush on her, and she didn't believe it. But I used to send her these very lecherous notes and told her that I wanted, if I had to go to an island, and I said this 3 or 4 times in interviews, if I had to go to an island and I could only take one person, I would take Carol Burnett. And I kept saying that and saying that and saying that. So finally, she sent me in the mail a picture of her in a bathing suit, and it said, "When?" We always had fun. When she came down here to do the play with me, you expect certain people to be so professional, And I didn't want her to be so professional. I wanted her to be crazy, but I thought, what the hell, we'll just do it, and she'll be funny, and it'll be wonderful and all that. Well, the first thing she did was nail my shoes to the floor. And I had loafers, and in the first scene, I rolled out of bed, stick my feet in the loafers, and went boom, right on my face. And I said, oh, okay, it's going to be one of those, right? So every night, I did some joke to her, and she did some joke to me. I put a frog in bed with us. I put, things like that. And she loved anything that made her crazy, and we just had so many laughs. She called me one day and said, we got a show lined up, and I think it'd be great if you did it with me, and we'd have fun, and anything you want, just tell me. And she was wonderful. I mean, just great. And I couldn't have had a better time. She would say it was a coup for them, but it was a coup for me. I loved her so much. I was such a fan, and I just wanted to not let her down. I wanted the show to be really good. I chose it because it's a song that you can fake your way through, and everybody loves that song. They're so familiar with the Humphrey Bogart movie that it was their song, I guess the same with Bergman and him. And I loved that movie, and I loved that song. And Carol said, yeah, let's do it. So I had a wonderful time. I don't consider myself a singer, and I'm scared, to death to do it. But I wasn't with her. She gave you such, I don't know, she made me feel like I could sing. And I would say, are you crazy? And she said, no, you could sing. And after a while, you think, well, maybe I can sing. A lot of it had to do with that song, and a lot of it had to do with their reaction to it. I told them they had a staircase there. And I said, why don't you let me fall down the stairs? And she said, oh, she got afraid I was going to break my arm or leg or something. And I said, well, if I do, we'll just write it in the script. And she said, what? And I said, don't worry about it. And I went up and went flying down the stairs and rolled over and crashed into a table and all that. And it was a good fall. And I said, did you get it? And one of the guys said, I had a little problem at the end because I didn't realize you were going into the table. I said, well, I'll do it again. So I went back up, and she kept saying, you don't have to do it again. You can just do the last part. We'll pick it up. I said, I know that, but I want to do it again because I just enjoy doing stuff like that. And I said, Alan Alda can't do this, So I went up and fell down and crashed into the table. And the guy got it, and it was good. So that was the take we used. It all starts at the top. And Carol had that wonderful sense of camaraderie with her cast. And anytime she felt one of them is having a problem, she'd fix it or do her best to fix it. And that group of people was an amazing group. I mean, in terms of liking each other and playing off each other and being really funny. They complimented each other. Their humor complimented each other, and it broke them up. It really and truly made them laugh. Harvey was one of those people that loved to play tricks on Carol, and he loved mistakes, Harvey's wonderful, and I understand why Tim Conway and Harvey were her favorite people, because they made her laugh all the time. Those are two really funny guys, very funny, and they loved each other, which you could tell. So it was fun to watch them, really fun, and I had a great time with them. At lunchtime, I would always go with the two of them across the street to that little restaurant bar, and we'd have way too many drinks and not too much to eat. And we came back thinking we were 3 times funnier than we were, but it was just a great time. The show was just wonderful. It's a tragedy there's not a show like that on television today. I loved Tim. I always thought he was the funniest of anybody. When I went to lunch, I was telling you, I would always beg him to come with me because I knew it would be wonderful, and laugh. And we had 1 million laughs. And he talked about who his favorite people were that did comedy, and how lucky we were to be working with Carol. He didn't care if he ever did anything else. He just would have been happy if he did that the rest of his life. Vicki went from just being a fan that lived in the valley and came in one day, and everybody was kind of astounded at how much she looked like Carol and carried herself. And so they wrote a little sketch for her. And her timing was great. It was just built in. She had the goods right away. So Carol always said, I never discovered her. She came in with all that. She was smart enough to realize how lucky she was. And she was ready to, do anything they wanted her to do. I kidded him about it, yeah, that he was taller than me. I didn't want to work with him. Or if I did work with him, I wanted him to be sitting down, And he thought I was not kidding, And he would try to work it out. And I finally had to tell him, look, I was just joking with you. You don't have to do that, But he was a very sweet guy. I worked with her a couple of times on different shows, and she was always wonderful, great fun, easy to work with. If the sketch wasn't working, she said, "What can I do to make it better?" And are you comfortable? I'd say, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, if you need anything or want anything," and she was just a guest, you know. But she would have busted her chops to make everybody happy. She was the perfect guest for Carol, the perfect friend of the star, you know. And they worked great together. And you could tell they liked each other enormously. You could just tell. You can't fake that. A lot of credit is her husband at the time. He kept a tight ship, and he wanted it to be great, but he also wanted it to fly by. I wasn't worried about her in the least. I knew that she was astounding in her talent, and Breaking Ground was, she'd been doing for a long time. It was obvious that she was going to leave there and soar, get her own show, and Gary be asking if he could guest on it, you know. Well, Carol made the difference. She must have visited me 10 times in the dressing room to see if everything was all right, you know, and did I want anything? And, did I want some booze? Did I want some water? Did I want anything? Cake, you know. And so I thought she was putting me on, so I said, "Yeah, I want some booze." And she said, "What kind?" I said, "Vodka." And so we went out and rehearsed. I came back, and there were 3 bottles of vodka on my desk. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to make her think I drank them all, you know? So I kind of stumbled out when we had the next rehearsal and tripped over things. And she said, how much did you drink? I said, "I drank everything. It was great." We just had such a good time, you know. She played terrible tricks on me, and I played wonderful tricks on her. She could come on today, and it would be a hit. I mean, it would go forever if they wanted it to. She's just a wonderful lady, and it came across. Her humor is perfect timing. When she goofed up, it was even funnier, you know. She couldn't remember a line or something. They always left it in because it was funnier than getting it right, you know. And she and I would forget things all the time, and she would do anything she could to break me up, and she did. I mean, it seemed unprofessional, I guess, to some people, but not to anybody down here. They loved. They talk about it still. I was there the night that she broke you up. I thought, well, that was every night, but you know, every night she made me get the giggles. She could do comedy in any era and make it work. And she never did do anything blue, I don't think. I mean, I know that we would get silly sometimes and say something that was off, you know, and you didn't want it to be on the air, but she'd get the giggles, so, you know, it'd take 5 minutes to get her back on track. But she never put it on the air, you know. We all miss you, and have you ever thought about coming back on the air? And I know it would work. And she'd say, "Oh, nobody would remember me." I can hear her saying all that. But comedy is comedy, and it works always. I mean, Red Skelton would work right now because it's funny. Funny is funny. And she was funny. Boy, was she funny. It's timeless the way I feel about her. If I had to go away to some place where they would come and get me for years, and I could have my choice of anybody to go with, I would want her. I'm so glad we had this time together, just to have a laugh or sing a song. Seems we just got started, and before you know it, comes the time to say so long.
I don't think I had ever met her. I had done Cinderella by that time on television, and I had done 2 Broadway musicals. So, and I believe I had probably done my first Disney musical as well, The Happiest Millionaire. So I was pretty much in that musical world, and that was when variety shows were so popular and so fabulous. And I guess my manager or agent probably just talked to them and got the booking for me at the time. I know she said in her introduction that I was starring in The Happiest Millionaire, so that must have just come out. And I was really young. I was like 19. So it was lovely that they gave me that opportunity. I loved Carol. I was a huge, huge, huge fan. Yeah, absolutely. And I had seen her on Broadway as well. Once Upon a Mattress. And I used to sneak into a lot of the Broadway. I grew up in Manhattan, and I used to sneak into a lot of the Broadway shows in the second act. So a lot of the first acts I haven't seen, but I saw her entire show, and I was a huge fan. And it was an incredible honor and thrill and scary, because I was young. I don't know how old Carol was. She was young as well, but I was 19, 20. I started out as a ballet dancer. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a ballerina, and I studied from the time I was 6 until really about 15. At 13, I auditioned for George Balanchine's School of American Ballet, and I got in, which was huge. But a lot of my friends were in Bye Bye Birdie at the time on Broadway, and I used to sneak in to the second act and watch them. And I started to get the musical theater bug, and I began taking jazz classes, and I started singing lessons, and I started acting lessons when I was 14, and I veered away from ballet, and I started auditioning for secretly. I didn't tell my parents. So I actually got the first show that I auditioned for, which was the National Company of Bye Bye Birdie. And, I was ecstatic. My parents, though, were not so ecstatic. And they didn't want me to do it. They wanted me to finish high school, which, of course, looking back, I'm really glad. But at the time, I thought my career was over. And I'm not kidding. I was devastated. I went to professional children's school, which allowed you to take your ballet acting classes while keeping up your academics. It was highly academic, but it also allowed you to go on auditions. So by my senior year, I had skipped a grade. I went from 7th to 9th grade. I started auditioning in a real way for the Broadway shows, and I got, over a 6-month period of auditioning, which was crazy, I got David Merrick's 110 in the Shade, and that was my first Broadway show. And I graduated high school at 16 and a half and turned 17 in the summer and was in rehearsal. They knew how old I was because they had a cast of young people, and they had, social workers and teachers, but they still, they felt strongly that I should stay at home, finish high school, and, do the right thing. I had a manager at the time, and she found out, I didn't know anything about it, but she knew about the audition for Cinderella. And there were many, many people auditioning, hundreds of young women. So my first audition, I was so scared. I was terrible. And Mr. Rogers, Richard Rogers, said to the director, she's not ready. Well, the director had seen me on Broadway in 110 in the Shade, so he basically begged him, and said, please give her another chance, just please, So he said, okay. And this time they brought me up to his apartment, which was on Park Avenue, Richard Rogers. Everybody was there. Charlie Dubin, the director, and John Green, the musical supervisor, Eugene Loring, the choreographer. It was, it was a huge, impressive group. But he asked everybody to leave the living room and to go into another room. And Richard Rogers sat down. He invited me to sit down next to him on the piano bench. And he proceeded to play and to teach me My Funny Valentine. And he's very specific about the way he wants things sung. The phrasing has to be exactly the way he wrote it. And I was such a baby girl, and I was so willing to do whatever. So I sang it exactly the way he wanted it, and I got the job, which was, incredible. I think I was having an out-of-body experience because I was so, I was so scared the first time I was frozen with fear. The second time, I think I was just, I don't know, I remember sitting next to him. I remember him teaching it to me and singing it phrase by phrase the way he wanted me to. More than that, I don't remember. And then I remember getting the call that I got the job, which was, a life-changing experience for me. Because that was an era when you were expected to sing the songs as written. That was part of that world and part of what you did. Obviously infusing your intention and your emotion and your take on the character. But basically, those songs were to be sung the way they were written. So when I did the Disney movies, it was the same thing. It was Richard and Robert Sherman, the famous Disney songwriters, Mary Poppins, etc. All of the Disney movies. You were taught the songs the way they were written, and then you kind of brought your own talent and artistry to it. When I moved past that time, then it was no longer that time anyway. You were encouraged to bring your own phrasing and bring your own perspective, and so it was a different time. They were everywhere. I know I did Carol's show, and I did the Jackie Gleason show, and I did I was on the Mike Douglas show a few times, which was an afternoon talk show. It wasn't really a variety show, but they had a lot of musical performers come on and do musical numbers. And I sang a few times on Johnny Carson, the Johnny Carson show, and those kinds of shows. But I think in terms of variety, those were the only two variety shows that I did. Hilarious, just so multi-talented. A standout talent. I mean, she was so magnetic and powerful and mesmerizing and funny, but also touching, and had so many colors to the palette of her talent. She was and is an amazingly brilliant woman, gifted. And that song at the end that she does in the last sort of third of the show, it's so beautiful and so moving and so dramatic. And, it just allows you to see, and those variety shows did, the breadth of her range, which is huge, and, so funny and such a forerunner to some of those, the Gilda Radners and all those wonderful women that are